I'm Captain Elena Ward, 30, and I built my career from nothing but grit, long hours, and the kind of discipline the Air Force demands. For years, I bent over backwards for my husband's family, showing up, helping out, trying to belong. But when his sister laughed at that barbecue and said no one would care if I disappeared, it flipped a switch I didn't know I had. Have you ever been dismissed or humiliated by someone you gave everything to? If you have, tell me your story in the comments. Trust me, you're not the only one. Before we get into what happened, tell me where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to stand your ground after being disrespected, hit like and subscribe for more stories about boundaries, respect, and walking away when you need to. What happened next might surprise you. I grew up in a small military town outside Spokane, where the sound of reveille was as familiar as my mother's voice. Dad served 22 years. Mom worked logistics for the Guard. Discipline wasn't something we discussed over dinner. It was woven into the fabric of our daily life, as natural as breathing. I learned early to occupy a specific role in our household, the quiet one, the competent one, the child who handled things. Grades came easily because I made them come easily. Chores were completed without reminder. Responsibilities were shouldered without complaint. There was no space for drama, no tolerance for excuses, and I absorbed that lesson completely. By the time I reached high school, I had already decided on ROTC. It wasn't a rebellious choice or even a particularly emotional one, it simply made sense. The military had given my parents structure, purpose, a way to build something meaningful. I wanted that same foundation. College passed in a blur of early morning PT sessions, classroom instruction, and the careful cultivation of leadership skills. I commissioned at 23 as a second lieutenant, standing in my blues while my parents pinned on my bars. Dad's hand trembled slightly as he secured the medal to my shoulder. He didn't say much, but I saw the pride in his eyes, and that was enough. The first few years were exactly what I expected: long hours, steep learning curves, and the constant pressure to prove myself capable. I moved through postings with the same quiet competence I developed as a child, never making waves, always delivering results. By 28, I'd pinned on captain and been assigned to run a small logistics element at Joint Base Lewis McChord. It wasn't glamorous work. No one writes songs about supply chains or equipment readiness, but it was important. I took pride in being the person others counted on, the officer who ensured missions succeeded because the details were handled correctly. That's where I met Mark. He wasn't military, which felt refreshing at first. He worked IT for a defense contractor, kept regular hours, lived a life that didn't revolve around inspections or deployments. He was quiet, reliable, steady in a way that complemented my own controlled intensity. We dated for 8 months before he proposed, and I said yes without hesitation. Marriage seemed like the logical next step, another box to check on the path toward a complete life. His family, though, that took adjustment. They were loud where mine had been measured, casual where mine had been formal, comfortable with a brand of teasing that sometimes felt less like affection and more like testing boundaries. Mark's sister Julia could dominate a room with her voice alone. His brother Daniel had opinions on everything and the confidence to share them whether invited or not. His parents, Marcy and Robert, presided over family gatherings with a kind of cheerful chaos that left me feeling perpetually off balance. I learned to smile through the jokes about military rigidity, to nod when they called me Captain America in that tone that wasn't quite mocking, but wasn't quite affectionate either. What bothered me more than the teasing was the imbalance I couldn't quite name at first. I drove 2 hours every weekend for family dinners, adjusting my duty schedule, burning leave days, making it work because that's what you did for family. When Mark's job went through an unstable patch, a contract ended unexpectedly, and suddenly his steady income evaporated, I covered bills without complaint. When Julia needed childcare because she wanted a break, I took her kids for entire weekends, entertaining them, feeding them, returning them scrubbed and happy. When Daniel mentioned he was thinking about joining the Air Force, I spent hours coaching him through PT standards, reviewing his application package, making calls to ensure his paperwork moved smoothly through the system. Every holiday, every birthday, every random Sunday gathering, I showed up with gifts, food, my time, my energy. I used precious leave days to attend events that meant something to them. I rearranged my life, repeatedly, to fit into theirs. And I told myself this was normal, that this was what family required, that my military background had simply made me more capable of carrying weight others couldn't. But slowly, quietly, the truth crystallized. No one had attended my commissioning ceremony. Not Mark's parents, who claimed the drive was too far. Not Julia or Daniel, who both said they had conflicts. Mark himself had come, but left early for a gaming tournament he'd forgotten about. When I pulled 12-hour shifts preparing for major inspections, the kind that could make or break careers, no one visited. No one called to ask if I needed anything. No one acknowledged the pressure I was under. When I tried to talk about my work, about the challenges of managing personnel and resources and competing priorities, eyes glazed over or the subject shifted to something more interesting. The only time my career came up naturally in conversation was when it served as a punchline. Julia would joke about me playing soldier, her tone just ambiguous enough that calling it out would make me seem oversensitive. Daniel once asked if I actually did anything important or just pushed papers around. Marcy would introduce me at gatherings as Mark's wife, the one in the Air Force, always in that order, as if my rank and position were decorative details rather than the result of years of work. I kept telling myself it was a cultural difference, that civilian families simply didn't understand military life, that I couldn't expect them to value what they didn't comprehend. But late at night, lying awake while Mark slept beside me, I'd face the simpler truth. I valued them more than they valued me. I had bent my life into shapes that accommodated theirs, and they had done nothing equivalent in return. They took what I offered, my time, my money, my expertise, my presence, and treated it as if it were owed rather than given. The worst part was how normalized it had become. I no longer expected acknowledgement. I no longer waited for reciprocity. I had accepted my role as the one who gave, who managed, who carried weight so others didn't have to. And because I accepted it, they never questioned it. I had taught them, through my own actions, that my needs were negotiable while theirs were not. I told myself I was being mature, that relationships required sacrifice, that not everything needed to be transactional. But somewhere deep in my chest, in a place I didn't examine too closely, something had begun to shift. The weight I carried hadn't lessened, it had just become more familiar. And familiar weight, I was learning, is the most dangerous kind, because you stop noticing it's there until suddenly you can't stand up anymore. The shift happened gradually, then all at once. Over the course of a year, Julia's teasing sharpened, developed edges that drew blood. The jokes about me playing soldier became comments about how I was bossy because of rank. When I'd organize something, a schedule, a plan for the holidays, anything that required coordination, she'd make little remarks about military rigidity, about how not everything needed a command structure. The others laughed, always. Mark would give me that look that meant, just let it go, and I did, because making an issue of it seemed petty. But the entitlement crept in alongside the mockery. Julia stopped asking if I could watch her kids, she just informed me. A text would arrive, dropping them off Saturday at 10, as if my weekends existed solely as backup childcare. She borrowed my car once when hers was in the shop and returned it with the gas tank on empty and fast food wrappers stuffed in the door pockets. When I mentioned it, trying to keep my tone light, she'd rolled her eyes. God, sorry, Captain. I'll remember to follow proper vehicle return protocol next time. The pattern became inescapable. I'd offer help with something, and she'd accept it as tribute. I'd gently correct a factual error. She'd once loudly insisted that Air Force captains were equivalent to Army sergeants, and I'd quietly clarified the rank structure, and she'd mutter, "Of course the captain knows best," in a voice that made knowledge sound like arrogance. Then she got close with a new friend group. They were mostly spouses of enlisted members from Accord, and they had developed a strange, bitter obsession with officer spouses. I pieced it together from Julia's phone calls, from overheard conversations at family gatherings. They traded stories about uppity officers' wives, about people who supposedly thought they wore their spouse's rank, about the imagined privileges and sneering superiority of anyone connected to the officer corps. Never mind that I'd earned my own rank, that my commission had nothing to do with Mark in their narrative. I was the enemy, the symbol of everything they resented about military hierarchy. Suddenly, every family gathering featured subtle digs. Julia's new friends would show up: Brandy, who'd married an E4 and treated it like a personality trait; Shauna, whose husband was an E5 and who seemed to keep a mental catalog of every perceived slight from officers, and the comments would start. Must be nice to have all that rank privilege. Bet you never have to worry about making ends meet on officer pay. Do they teach you to look down on people at officer training, or does that come naturally? I'd respond calmly, factually. I'd explain that junior officers often made less than senior enlisted when you factored in allowances. I'd note that I worked 60-hour weeks regularly. I'd point out that I'd never claimed superiority over anyone. But facts didn't matter. They'd decided on a narrative, and I was simply playing the role they'd written for me. The worst part was watching Mark absorb their attitude. He started shrugging when they said something particularly cutting. "It's just how they joke," he'd whisper afterward, as if repetition made cruelty into humor. When I tried to talk to him about it seriously, about how his sister's behavior had changed, about how uncomfortable these gatherings had become, he'd minimize it. "You're taking things too personally. They don't mean anything by it. Can't you just relax?" But the jokes only traveled one direction. No one mocked Julia for being a stay-at-home mom or Daniel for working retail. No one made Marcy feel small for her life choices or needled Robert about his job. The criticism, the casual dismissal, the constant low-grade hostility, that was reserved exclusively for me. And when I pointed this out to Mark, he looked at me like I was being difficult, like I was manufacturing problems where none existed. I started to dread the drive to their house. Started fabricating reasons I might need to stay on base for the weekend. Started feeling my chest tighten when Julia's name appeared on my phone. The family I'd worked so hard to embrace, to fold myself into, to serve and support, they'd turned me into their collective punching bag, and I'd somehow become the problem for noticing. At work, I was respected. My senior NCO, SMSGT Angela Rios, trusted my judgment. My commander, Lieutenant Call Harper, had written in my last performance report that I was a decisive leader with exceptional organizational skills. The airmen in my section knew I'd fight for them, that I'd take the heat when things went wrong and share the credit when things went right. I was competent, valued, effective. But every Sunday, I drove 2 hours to be treated like an inconvenient joke. I told myself it would improve. That Julia was going through something, that the friend group would lose its appeal, that Mark would eventually notice how one-sided everything had become. I told myself that family was worth the discomfort, that relationships required patience, that I was strong enough to weather this. But strength isn't infinite. And patience, I was learning, can look a lot like complicity if you're not careful. The foundation was cracking, hairline fractures spreading through something I'd thought was solid. I just hadn't admitted it yet, hadn't let myself examine the damage closely enough to see that some of those cracks had already split clean through. The Sunday started like any other. I'd worked the overnight shift, a logistics emergency that required someone at the O3 level to authorize equipment transfers, and finished at 0800 hours. I was supposed to go home, shower, change, sleep. Instead, I'd driven straight to Mark's parents' house because Julia's birthday barbecue had been on the calendar for weeks, and I'd promised to bring my famous potato salad. I showed up in uniform because there simply hadn't been time for anything else. The cookout was casual anyway: folding chairs, cheap beer, hot dogs on a propane grill that Robert treated like a sacred ritual. I parked behind Daniel's truck, grabbed the covered dish from my passenger seat, and walked into the backyard through the side gate. The usual crowd had gathered: Mark's parents, Julia and her husband, Daniel and his girlfriend, a handful of Julia's friends including Brandy and Shauna. Kids ran circles around the adults, shrieking with the particular joy of sugar and freedom. Someone had set up a speaker playing country music at a volume that made conversation require effort. Mark was already there, beer in hand, laughing at something his father had said. He glanced at me, smiled vaguely, turned back to the conversation. I crossed the yard to the food table, set down the potato salad, accepted a water bottle from Marcy, who looked at my uniform and said, "Lord, Elena, couldn't you change first?" Not maliciously, just thoughtlessly, as if my 36 hours without sleep were a minor inconvenience I should have managed better. "Came straight from work," I said, keeping my voice even. "Didn't have time." "Well, you're here now," she said, patting my arm before drifting away to check on the children. I stood by the food table for a moment, drinking water, feeling the exhaustion settle into my bones. Julia noticed me from across the yard. She said something to Brandy, and they both looked at me, and I knew, the way you know certain things in your body before your brain catches up, that something was coming. Julia walked over, followed by Brandy and Shauna. She was holding a beer, wearing sunglasses despite the clouds, smiling in a way that didn't reach anywhere meaningful. "Elena," she said, loud enough that conversations nearby paused. "Thanks for gracing us with your presence. I know your schedule is so demanding." "Happy birthday," I said, matching her volume, refusing to give her the reaction she wanted. "Hope you like the potato salad." "Oh, I'm sure it's perfect," she said. "You're very good at following recipes." "Orders. Instructions." She took a sip of beer, and I could see her winding up to something, could feel the attention of the yard shifting toward us. Must be nice, though, being so important. Having all that authority. "What is it you always say in my command?" "Element," I corrected quietly. "I run a logistics element." Right, she said, waving her hand dismissively. "So important. So vital. Really, we should all be grateful you found time for us little people." I felt Mark's eyes on me from across the yard. He was watching, but not moving, not intervening. Just watching to see what I'd do. I kept my expression neutral, my posture relaxed. "I'm happy to be here," I said, meaning none of it. Julia leaned in slightly, and her voice dropped just enough that only the people immediately around us could hear. But she was still performing, still making sure her audience caught every word. "You know what's funny?" she said. "I was just telling Brandy, if you disappeared tomorrow, even your command wouldn't care. They'd just plug someone else into your spot and move on like you were never there." The words hung in the air. Someone's child laughed in the distance. The country music kept playing. Brandy smirked. Shauna looked delighted. Robert flipped a burger. The normalcy of the moment somehow made it worse, as if cruelty could only exist in mundane spaces, camouflaged by hot dogs and folding chairs. Then Julia raised her voice again, making sure everyone heard. "If you vanished, even your command wouldn't care. None of us would." The group laughed. Not nervous laughter, not uncomfortable laughter, genuine amusement, as if she'd delivered the punchline to a joke they'd all been waiting for. Daniel chuckled from his chair. Marcy smiled indulgently. "Mark, and this is the part that broke something fundamental," Mark laughed. He actually laughed, standing there with his beer, surrounded by his family, and he laughed at the suggestion that my disappearance would be meaningless. I didn't break. I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice or make a scene. I'd been yelled at by chiefs and colonels, had stood in front of review boards, had managed crises that involved actual consequences. I could handle a backyard insult. I looked at Julia directly, let 3 full seconds of silence stretch out, and said quietly, calmly, with absolute clarity, "We'll see." Then I turned, walked back through the side gate, got in my car, and drove away. I didn't slam the door. I didn't peel out of the driveway. I just left, the same way I'd arrived, except now I carried the certain knowledge that I would never return. My phone started buzzing before I reached the main road. Mark's name lit up the screen. I let it ring through to voicemail. He called again. I silenced it. By the time I pulled into my driveway, he'd called 6 times and sent a string of texts I didn't read. I walked into our house, still in uniform, and stood in the living room I'd decorated, surrounded by furniture I'd mostly paid for, in a space that suddenly felt like it belonged to someone else's life. Mark came home an hour later, letting the door slam behind him in a way he knew I hated. "Are you serious right now?" he said. "You embarrass me in front of my entire family." I looked at him standing there, indignant, as if I were the one who'd crossed a line. "What did I do that was embarrassing?" "You just walked out. Over a joke." Julia was kidding. She said if I disappeared, no one would care. Your whole family laughed. You laughed. He ran his hand through his hair, that gesture he made when he wanted me to drop something. "Because it was a joke, Elena. You're making it into this huge thing when it was just Julia being Julia." "Julia being Julia," I repeated. "Tell me, Mark, when exactly did Julia being Julia start, including telling me I'm worthless? At what point did we decide that was acceptable?" "She didn't say you were worthless." "Jesus. You're twisting everything." "Then what did she say?" He hesitated, and I saw him realize he couldn't actually defend the words, could only defend his decision not to care about them. Look, he said finally. I know she can be a lot sometimes. But you overreacted. You always overreact to her. I left, I said. I didn't yell. I didn't insult anyone. I just removed myself from a situation where I was being disrespected. That's not overreacting. That's having boundaries. It's my sister's birthday. I know. I made potato salad. I drove there in uniform straight from a 36-hour shift. I showed up for her, Mark. What exactly did she do for me? He stared at me like I was speaking a foreign language, like the concept of reciprocity was genuinely confusing to him. And that's when I understood he would never see it. Not the imbalance, not the disrespect, not the slow erosion of my dignity that had been happening for years. To him, this was just me being difficult about something that didn't matter. Are you really upset about a joke? He asked. I didn't answer. The distance between us had already settled in, cold and complete, and nothing I said would bridge it. So I walked past him, climbed the stairs, and closed the bedroom door on whatever remained of our marriage. The next morning at work, I moved through my routine with mechanical precision. Equipment manifests, personnel schedules, coordination with maintenance, the familiar rhythm of logistics work that had always steadied me. But SMSGT Angela Rios noticed immediately. She'd been my senior enlisted for 2 years, had deployed with me once, had seen me handle everything from equipment failures to personnel crises without breaking. She knew my baseline, and she knew I was off. She found me at 1300 hours, reviewing supply requisitions in my office. She knocked once, entered without waiting for permission, a privilege I'd granted her specifically, and closed the door behind her. Ma'am, she said. What's wrong? I looked up from the paperwork, started to deflect, then stopped. There was no point in pretending. Not with Rios. Family stuff, I said. She pulled up a chair without being invited and sat across from my desk. I've got time. So I told her. Not everything, not the full history of accommodations and disappointments, but enough. The barbecue, the comment, the laughter, Mark's dismissal. I kept my voice level factual, the way I'd brief a situation report. But Rios had known me long enough to hear what I wasn't saying. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she leaned forward, elbows on her knees, and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Ma'am, she said. I'm going to say something, and I need you to actually hear it. Can you do that? Yes, SMSGT. Disrespect grows in the shadows. Once you see it clearly, you can't unsee it. And you shouldn't try to. She paused. You're seeing it now, aren't you? I nodded slowly. I think I've been seeing it for a while. I just kept telling myself I was wrong. You weren't wrong. She leaned back. Look, ma'am, I don't know your husband or his family. But I know you. I've watched you lead, and you're good at it because you give a damn about the people under your command. You protect your people. You fight for them. You take responsibility when things go wrong and credit when things go right. She paused. Are they doing that for you? No. Then why are you protecting them? The question hit me squarely. I had no answer that didn't sound like weakness disguised as virtue. Rios stood up. Whatever you decide, ma'am, you've got support here. Don't forget that. She left quietly, pulling the door closed behind her. I sat alone in my office, staring at requisition forms I could no longer focus on. I thought about all the times I'd swallowed disrespect to keep peace. All the moments I'd minimized my own feelings because addressing them would create conflict. Every instance I'd let Mark's family treat my career like a party trick instead of a commitment built on years of work and sacrifice. I thought about Julia's comment at the barbecue, but more than that, I thought about the laughter that followed. The easy, comfortable amusement of people who genuinely believed I was disposable. Who had accepted so many favors, so much emotional labor, so much of my time and energy, and still found my absence funny rather than concerning. That night, I went home to the house I shared with Mark and looked at everything with new eyes. The furniture I'd bought when his job was unstable. The photos on the wall from his family gatherings, where I stood at the edges smiling. The calendar stuck to the refrigerator, where his family's events were marked in permanent ink and my duty schedule was penciled in lightly, subject to change, always negotiable. Mark was in the living room, watching television. He looked up when I entered. Are we going to talk about yesterday? What's there to talk about? I asked. You left my sister's party. You embarrassed me. I think you owe her an apology. I stood very still. You think I owe her an apology? Yes. For what, specifically? He sighed, that exasperated sound he made when he thought I was being deliberately difficult. For making a scene. For walking out. For treating a joke like it was some kind of attack. She said if I disappeared, no one would care. You laughed. Because it was funny, Elena. It was a joke. No, I said quietly. It was the truth dressed up as humor. And the fact that you can't see the difference tells me everything I need to know. I walked upstairs, pulled a duffel bag from the closet, and started packing. Not everything, just essentials. Uniforms, toiletries, personal documents, the things I'd need immediately. Mark appeared in the doorway, watching with an expression of disbelief. What are you doing? Leaving. Because of one joke? Because of 3 years of being the only person who gives without receiving. Because your family treats me like I'm lucky to be included, and you enable it. Because yesterday you laughed when your sister said I don't matter, and you still think I'm the problem for being hurt. I zipped the bag. Because I'm tired, Mark. I'm tired of fighting to be valued by people who should value me automatically. You're being dramatic. Maybe, I said. Or maybe I'm finally being honest. I walked past him, bag over my shoulder, and left. He didn't follow. I checked into a hotel near base, laid out my uniforms for the week, and slept more soundly than I had in months. The reassignment paperwork took 3 weeks to process. An opening at Luke Air Force Base in Arizona, a logistics officer position at the O3 level, temporary pending promotion board results. I put in for it without mentioning it to Mark. When the orders came through, I signed them immediately. I told Mark on a Tuesday evening. He was scrolling through his phone, half watching television, barely registering my presence. I got reassignment orders, I said. I'm moving to Luke. He looked up. What? Luke Air Force Base. Arizona. I leave in 2 weeks. He set his phone down, finally giving me his full attention. You're moving? Without discussing it with me. There's nothing to discuss. The orders are approved. We're married, Elena. You don't just move to another state without talking to your husband. You're right, I said. In a functional marriage, you don't. But we stopped being functional the moment you laughed at your sister's joke. His face darkened. So this is punishment. You're uprooting our entire life to punish me for one mistake. This isn't punishment. This is preservation. I'm choosing to exist somewhere I'm actually valued. My family values you. I laughed, short, bitter, genuine. Mark, your family has never valued me. They've tolerated me. They've used me. But valued? No. And you've been so busy keeping the peace that you never noticed. So you're just giving up. I'm accepting reality. There's a difference. The fight that followed was predictable. He accused me of overreacting, of being selfish, of destroying our marriage over nothing. I stayed calm, refused to engage with the emotional manipulation, simply repeated the facts. I had orders. I was leaving. Our marriage had been dying slowly for years, and this was just the moment I stopped pretending otherwise. I didn't tell his family. That wasn't cruelty, it was self-protection. I packed methodically, shipped boxes to Luke, arranged temporary housing. Mark alternated between anger and bargaining, but never once did he actually apologize. Never once did he acknowledge that his family had mistreated me, that he'd enabled it, that I had legitimate reasons to leave beyond vindictiveness. 3 days before I flew out, Julia called me. Her voice on the phone was sharp, accusatory. Mark says you're leaving him. I'm accepting reassignment orders. You're abandoning the family. I almost laughed. Julia, I haven't abandoned anyone. I've stopped volunteering to be disrespected. You're that upset about a joke? Jesus, Elena, get over yourself. Tell me something, I said. When's the last time you drove 2 hours to see me? When's the last time you covered my bills or watched my kids or helped me with anything at all? Silence on the line. That's what I thought, I said. I gave you 3 years of weekends, childcare, money, time, effort. And you repaid it by telling me I wouldn't be missed. So no, Julia, I'm not abandoning anyone. I'm just no longer available to be your punching bag. I hung up before she could respond. Marcy left a voicemail, crying, asking me to reconsider, saying I was tearing the family apart. Robert sent a text, this seems extreme. Daniel didn't reach out at all. The night before I left, Mark made one final attempt. If you do this, he said, we're done. You know that, right? I know. And you're okay with that? I looked at him, this man I'd married, who I'd believed would be my partner, who had proven repeatedly that his family's comfort mattered more than my dignity. Yes, I said. I'm okay with that. I flew to Arizona on a Thursday morning. Mark didn't come to the airport. I didn't expect him to. The messages started within days. A cousin I barely knew, Julia's really hurt. Can't you forgive? One of Mark's friends, you're blowing up your marriage over one comment? Even my pastor reached out, gently suggesting that counseling might help, that marriages were worth fighting for. I responded to each message with the same basic answer, phrased slightly differently each time. I'm not blowing up anything. I'm declining to rebuild on a foundation that was never solid. The most telling message came from Brandy, Julia's friend who'd been at the barbecue. She sent a Facebook message dripping with false concern. I hope you know how much you've hurt Julia. She was just joking around, and now you've destroyed Mark's family. I hope you can live with yourself. I blocked her without responding. What surprised me was how little I felt. No guilt, no regret, no second guessing. Just a profound, settling relief, like I'd been holding my breath for 3 years and finally exhaled. Luke Air Force Base was hot, dry, completely different from Washington. My new team was professional, competent, welcoming. My commander, a lieutenant colonel named Morrison, shook my hand at in processing and said, heard good things about your work at Lewis McChord. Glad to have you. No one here knew me as Mark's wife. No one knew the history. I was just Captain Elena Ward, logistics officer, and that was enough. 6 months after I left, I started hearing things. Not from Mark's family directly, I'd blocked most of them on social media and ignored their calls, but through peripheral channels. A mutual friend who hadn't taken sides. A former coworker from Lewis McChord who stayed in touch. Julia had tried to maintain her usual routine, hosting family gatherings, organizing events, but without my contributions, the logistics had become obvious. She couldn't afford to host as frequently without my financial help. Her childcare options had evaporated now that I wasn't available for free weekends. The elaborate holiday celebrations that I'd largely organized and funded had scaled back dramatically. Mark had moved back in with his parents. His IT contract had ended 6 months ago, around the same time I'd left, and he'd struggled to find comparable work. Without my income covering half the mortgage and bills, he'd lost the house. Marcy apparently complained to anyone who'd listened that having Mark back home was straining their retirement budget. Daniel's Air Force application had stalled. Without my guidance and connections, he'd submitted paperwork with errors, missed deadlines, failed to follow up appropriately. He'd finally gotten a recruiter to work with him, but the timeline had pushed back significantly. The family had stopped hosting regular gatherings entirely. Too expensive, too complicated, too much work without someone doing the invisible labor of planning and preparation. The cousins I'd seen at every event, the extended network that had treated me like furniture, they'd scattered, found other families with more functional dynamics to attach themselves to. I heard all this secondhand and felt nothing except a mild, detached interest, like reading about strangers in a news article. At Luke, my life had simplified and expanded simultaneously. I'd been promoted to major after a strong performance board, pinned on 04 at 31, slightly ahead of typical timeline. I'd taken over a larger logistics section, managed a deployment cycle, earned commendations for my work. My new commander, now a full colonel, had written in my performance report that I was an exceptionally capable officer with unlimited potential. I'd made friends here, other officers, both male and female, who understood the demands of military life, who respected competence, who treated me like a complete person rather than a supporting character in someone else's story. I went hiking on weekends, explored Phoenix, took leave days for actual vacation rather than family obligations. I started dating someone, another Air Force officer, a captain in acquisitions named Michael Chin. Nothing serious yet, just dinners and conversations, and the novel experience of spending time with someone who was genuinely interested in my thoughts. Who asked about my day and actually listened to the answer. Who treated my career with respect rather than bemused tolerance. At the 1-year mark after I'd left, a message appeared in my Facebook message requests. I almost deleted it without looking. I'd become ruthless about digital boundaries, but something made me open it. It was from Julia. The message was long, carefully written, clearly revised multiple times. It started with an apology, vague, qualified, the kind that used passive voice to avoid full responsibility. Mistakes were made rather than I made mistakes. But as it continued, something shifted. She admitted she'd been jealous of my career, my education, my financial stability. She acknowledged that her friend group had encouraged resentment rather than understanding. She said she'd been wrong at the barbecue, that the comment was cruel, that she'd known it was cruel even as she'd said it. The message ended with a direct request. I'd like to try to rebuild our relationship. I understand if that's not possible, but I wanted you to know I'm sorry. I read it 3 times. Looked for manipulation, for guilt tripping, for any indication that this was performance rather than genuine reflection. I couldn't find it. The apology seemed real. I sat with it for a week before responding. When I finally did, I kept it brief. Thank you for the apology. I appreciate that you recognize the harm. I'm not ready for regular contact, but I'm willing to leave the door open for the future. I hope you and your family are doing well. Polite. Bounded. Final enough to protect myself, open enough to acknowledge her effort. She didn't push. She simply responded, I understand. Thank you for even reading this. Mark sent his own message 2 weeks later. His was shorter, less introspective, more focused on logistics, divorce paperwork, asset division, the practical dissolution of a marriage that had been dead long before I'd left. I agreed to everything he proposed. Neither of us fought. There was nothing left worth fighting over. The divorce finalized quietly, processed through military legal assistance and Arizona family court. I signed papers, he signed papers, and 3 years of marriage dissolved into a court filing. I felt nothing except relief that it was handled. I never heard from Marcy, Robert, or Daniel. They'd apparently decided I was the villain in their family story, and there was no point in revising their narrative. I didn't care enough to correct them. My life in Arizona solidified. I put down actual roots, bought a small house near base, adopted a dog, a rescue shepherd mix that a friend was fostering. I took up running again, something I'd loved in college, but abandoned when Mark's schedule had consumed my free time. I reconnected with old Air Force friends I'd lost touch with, built a network that had nothing to do with who I'd been married to. The work remained challenging, demanding, occasionally frustrating, but it was work I chose, work I was good at, work that mattered. And when I went home at the end of long days, I went home to a space that was entirely mine, where no one expected me to perform gratitude for being tolerated. 14 months after the barbecue, I was sitting in my backyard in Arizona, drinking coffee and watching my dog chase lizards, when my phone buzzed with a notification. Someone had tagged me in an old photo on Facebook, one of Mark's cousins, posting throwback pictures from a family gathering 3 years prior. In the photo, I was standing at the edge of the frame, holding Julia's youngest daughter, smiling at something off camera. The caption read, "Miss the big family gatherings." Nothing's been the same. The comments were what caught my attention. Julia had written, "We took a lot for granted." Marcy had added, "Some people you don't appreciate until they're gone." I stared at the screen for a long moment, then closed the app without responding. They were having realizations, experiencing consequences, finally understanding what they'd lost. But those realizations weren't my responsibility to manage or validate. They'd had years to appreciate me while I was present. They'd chosen not to, and now they were living with that choice. That afternoon, I had a meeting with Colonel Morrison about a potential deployment opportunity, a logistics coordination role in Germany, 6 months, high visibility, career enhancing. It would mean leaving Luke temporarily, but it was exactly the kind of assignment that led to command positions later. "I want you to think about it," Morrison said. "But between us, Ward, you're exactly the kind of officer we need in these roles. You're organized, you're unflappable, and people trust you. That's rare." "Thank you, sir," I said. "I don't need to think about it. I'll take the assignment." He smiled. "Good. I'll start the paperwork." Walking out of his office, I felt the weight of validation from someone whose opinion actually mattered. Not from people who'd taken my competence for granted, but from leadership who recognized value and said so explicitly. That evening, I video called my parents, something I'd been doing more frequently since the divorce. Dad was grayer than I remembered, but sharp as ever. Mom asked about the Germany opportunity, whether I'd need help with the house while I was deployed. "I've got it handled," I said. "But thank you." "You always do," Dad said, and there was pride in his voice that I'd stopped expecting from family. After we hung up, I pulled up Julia's Facebook message from weeks earlier, the apology I'd acknowledged but not fully engaged with. I reread it with fresh perspective, trying to decide if I wanted any form of reconciliation, even a distant one. The answer settled clearly, maybe someday. But not now. Not when I was finally building something solid, something that didn't require me to shrink or accommodate or perform gratitude for basic respect. I deleted the message thread. Not out of anger, out of closure. Michael came over that night. We'd been dating for 4 months now, moving slowly, building something careful and mutual. He brought Thai food and didn't ask why I seemed contemplative. Just sat with me on the back patio, threw a ball for my dog, existed comfortably in shared silence. "I got offered a deployment," I said eventually. "Germany, 6 months. "That's great," he said immediately. "You'll be amazing. You're not worried about the distance?" He smiled. "Elena, you're going to Germany to do important work for 6 months. I'm not going to make that about me." And there it was, the difference that mattered. Someone who saw my career as legitimate, who supported my choices without requiring me to manage his feelings about them, who treated my success as something to celebrate rather than accommodate. We talked logistics, made tentative plans for him to visit if his schedule allowed, agreed that 6 months was manageable. And I realized I was building the life I'd always wanted, the one where my work mattered, where my choices were respected, where I wasn't constantly fighting to justify my own existence in my own story. The people who joked I wouldn't be missed had been wrong about my command caring. They'd been catastrophically wrong about whether I could thrive without them. And somewhere in Washington, they were beginning to understand that the person they'd treated as disposable had actually been the foundation holding things together. I didn't need their realizations. I didn't need their regret. I'd built something better without them, and that was vindication enough. 18 months after I left Washington, Lieutenant Col Morrison pulled me aside after a section briefing. "Ward, I need to talk to you about something." "My office, 1500 hours. "Yes, sir," I said, running through recent work in my mind, trying to identify what might require a private conversation. At 1500 hours exactly, I knocked on his door. He waved me in, gestured to a chair. "Close the door," he said, and I felt my chest tighten slightly. Closed-door conversations went one of 2 ways. "I'm putting you in for Lieutenant Colonel," he said without preamble. "Your performance has been exceptional. Your deployment to Germany was exactly what we needed, and you're ready for O5 responsibility. I wanted to tell you before the formal paperwork starts circulating." The relief and pride hit simultaneously. "Thank you, sir. I won't let you down." "You haven't yet." He smiled. "Between us, Ward, I've seen a lot of officers come through. You're one of the ones who actually gets better under pressure. That's rare. Don't waste it." Walking out of his office, I let myself feel the full weight of what he'd said. Lieutenant Colonel at 32, if the board approved, ahead of most timelines, recognition that the work mattered, that I mattered. Everything I'd wanted from Mark's family, basic acknowledgement of my competence, my commitment, my value, I'd found here, in the place I'd fled to. That evening, I was meeting Angela Rios for dinner. She'd rotated to Luke 6 months after I'd arrived, and we'd rebuilt our working relationship into an actual friendship. We met at a Mexican restaurant off base, and I told her about Morrison's news. "Congratulations, ma'am," she said, raising her margarita. "You earned it." "I had good NCOs," I said. She laughed. "Don't deflect. You're allowed to be proud of yourself." We talked about the promotion timeline, the responsibilities that came with O5, the likelihood I'd be given a command position. Then she changed subjects. "How's Michael?" "Good," I said. "He's putting in for a fellowship at Air University. If it comes through, he'd be at Maxwell for a year. Long distance again? Probably. But it's a good opportunity for him. We'll figure it out." Rios studied me for a moment. "You've changed, you know. Since Washington." "How?" "You take up space now. Not aggressively, just naturally. Like you finally believe you're allowed to exist without apologizing for it." I thought about that. She was right. Somewhere in the process of leaving, rebuilding, and thriving, I'd stopped performing the careful, accommodating version of myself I'd maintained in Mark's family. I'd stopped shrinking to make other people comfortable. I guess I decided I'd rather be alone than diminished, I said. You're not alone, though. You've got a whole network here. People who actually see you. She was right about that, too. I'd built friendships with other officers, with civilians who worked on base, with people in my neighborhood. I had a life that didn't revolve around making myself useful to people who'd never valued the effort. Later that week, I got a message from an unknown number. It turned out to be Daniel, Mark's brother. The message was short. Hey, just wanted to say congrats on the promotion. Mark mentioned he saw it on your official bio. You were always too good for our family anyway. Hope you're doing well. I stared at the message, trying to decide how to respond. Finally, I typed, thank you. I appreciate that. Hope you're doing well too. He replied immediately. Got into the Air Force finally. Basic training in 2 months. Thanks for the help you gave me before. I know I didn't say it at the time. Congratulations, I wrote back. Best of luck. That was the end of the conversation. No deepening connection, no attempt to rebuild a relationship that had never really existed. Just two polite adults acknowledging a past interaction and moving forward separately. I never heard from Mark directly. Through occasional glimpses of social media, friends of friends, public posts, I pieced together that he'd moved to Oregon, found a new IT job, started dating someone. Good for him. I meant that genuinely. Our marriage had been a mismatch from the beginning, sustained by my willingness to accommodate and his willingness to let me. We were both better off apart. Julia's apology remained the only substantive outreach I'd received from that family, and I'd chosen not to pursue it. Maybe someday I'd feel differently. Maybe time would soften things enough that casual contact would feel acceptable. But I wasn't there yet, and I wasn't in a hurry to get there. Michael's fellowship came through. We celebrated with dinner at the nicest restaurant in Phoenix, made plans for how we'd handle the year apart, promised to visit when schedules allowed. He left for Alabama in January, and I threw myself into work, preparing for the promotion board, taking on additional responsibilities, proving Morrison's faith in me wasn't misplaced. The promotion board met in March. I got the notification in April, selected for Lieutenant Colonel, promotion effective June 1st. I'd pin on 05 at 32 years old, firmly on track for potential command positions, squadron leadership, the career trajectory I'd always wanted. My parents flew out for the promotion ceremony. It was small, just a handful of close friends, my immediate chain of command, Angela Rios serving as one of the people who pinned on my new rank. Colonel Morrison gave a brief speech about my performance, my potential, my character. My father pinned on one side while my mother pinned on the other, both of them visibly proud in a way they rarely expressed verbally. Afterward, at the small reception, Dad pulled me aside. Your mother and I are proud of you, he said. Not just the rank, though that's impressive. The way you've built your life. The choices you've made. That takes courage. Thanks, Dad. Mark's family ever reach out? Occasionally. Nothing meaningful. He nodded. Their loss. And that was all that needed to be said. 2 years after the barbecue, I was established, respected, and whole. I'd survived the promotion board, pinned on Lieutenant Colonel, taken command of a larger logistics squadron. My days were full: personnel management, resource allocation, strategic planning, the endless coordination that kept an Air Force installation functioning. I loved it. Not every moment, not every frustrating meeting or bureaucratic obstacle, but the overall architecture of the work, the knowledge that I was contributing to something larger than myself. Michael had finished his fellowship and returned to Arizona. We'd moved in together, a deliberate choice after 2 years of careful dating, of building something mutual and respectful. He was in acquisitions now, working on different projects, but understanding the demands of military life in a way Mark never had. We cooked together, ran together, existed in comfortable partnership, where neither of us diminished the other. My squadron was performing well. We'd aced a major inspection, deployed personnel smoothly to support operations overseas, maintained readiness standards that made higher headquarters take notice. My boss, a colonel named Patterson, had told me explicitly that I was on track for bigger things, potentially a group command position, maybe even higher staff work if I wanted it. I'd found my place. One afternoon in late summer, I was reviewing reports in my office when my phone buzzed with a Facebook notification. Someone had posted in a private group I'd apparently been part of years ago, Mark's extended family group that I'd forgotten I'd even joined. The notification preview showed Julia Ellison posted for the first time in months. Curious despite myself, I opened it. Julia had posted a photo from 2 years earlier, the barbecue where everything had broken. In the photo, I was visible in the background, in uniform, setting down the potato salad I'd brought. The image was candid, caught in the moment before the confrontation. Her caption read, 2 years ago today. I said something I can never take back, and I lost someone who'd been nothing but kind to our family. Elena, if you ever see this, I'm sorry. Truly. You deserved better from all of us. The comments were a mix of family members expressing confusion, asking what happened, and a few who clearly remembered the incident expressing their own regrets. Marcy had written, "We miss you, Elena. The family hasn't been the same." Daniel added, "She was always the best part of these gatherings. We were too stupid to realize it." I read through the thread twice, feeling oddly detached from the drama they were processing. They were having their realizations, working through their regrets, finally acknowledging what they'd lost. But it was happening in a space I'd already left, emotionally and literally. Their growth wasn't my responsibility to validate or reward. I closed the app without commenting. That evening, Michael and I were making dinner together, a comfortable routine we developed where one person cooked and the other cleaned as we went. I mentioned the Facebook post while chopping vegetables. "How do you feel about it?" he asked. "Honestly? Nothing. It's like reading about people I used to know but don't anymore." "That's healthy," he said. "You don't owe them forgiveness just because they finally figured out they were wrong." "No," I agreed. "I don't." We ate dinner on the back patio, threw the ball for the dog, talked about his upcoming trip to a conference in Colorado. Normal life, built on mutual respect and actual partnership. The kind of relationship I'd thought I had with Mark until I'd realized I was the only one building it. Later that night, I did something I hadn't done in months. I looked up Mark's Facebook profile. It was public enough that I could see his basic information. He was still in Oregon, still working IT, still dating the woman he'd been seeing for over a year now. His profile picture showed them at a coast somewhere, both smiling, looking happy. Good, I thought. Genuinely good. He deserved happiness, just not with me, not in a relationship where I carried all the weight while he coasted on my effort. I closed his profile and didn't look back. The next day at work, Colonel Patterson called me into his office. "Ward, I'm putting your name forward for a special assignment. Pentagon Liaison for Logistics Coordination. It's a year in DC, high visibility, direct impact on policy. You interested?" "Absolutely, sir." "Good. I'll let you know when I hear more." Walking back to my office, I thought about how different my life looked now compared to 2 years ago. Then, I'd been Captain Ward, trapped in a marriage and family dynamic that diminished me, driving 2 hours every weekend to be tolerated by people who'd never valued my presence. Now, I was Lieutenant Colonel Ward, commander of a successful squadron, in a healthy relationship, being offered career opportunities that could shape policy. The people who'd joked I wouldn't be missed had no idea where I'd ended up. They were still in Washington, presumably still hosting smaller gatherings, still managing the gaps my absence had created. And I was here, thriving, building a career and life that had nothing to do with their limited perception of my worth. Angela Rios stopped by my office late in the afternoon. "Ma'am, got a minute?" "Always." She closed the door, which meant this was personal rather than professional. I saw the Facebook post. Julia's apology. "How did you, Daniel and I are friends on Facebook." He shared it. She paused. "You doing okay?" "Yeah," I said. "Actually, yes. It's strange, I thought I'd feel something. Vindication, maybe, or anger that it took them this long. But I just feel distant from it. Like it's not really about me anymore." "That's because it isn't," Rios said. "They're processing their own guilt. You've already moved on." She was right. I'd moved on geographically, professionally, emotionally. I'd built a completely different life, one where I didn't have to fight for basic respect, where my competence was assumed rather than questioned, where my presence was valued automatically. That weekend, I went hiking with Michael and two other couples we'd become friends with, all military or former military, all people who understood the lifestyle, the demands, the sacrifices. We spent the day in the Superstition Mountains, talking and laughing and existing in easy companionship. No one made jokes at anyone else's expense. No one expected anyone else to diminish themselves for the group's comfort. This, I thought, was what community was supposed to feel like. On the drive home, Michael reached over and took my hand. "You seem happy," he said. "I am," I realized. Completely, thoroughly happy, in a way I hadn't been in years. Maybe ever. "Good," he said simply. That night, before bed, I did one final thing. I went into Facebook settings and removed myself from Mark's family group. I didn't announce it, didn't make a statement. Just quietly extracted myself from the last digital connection to that chapter of my life. The next morning, I woke up to an email from Colonel Patterson. The Pentagon liaison assignment was approved if I wanted it. 1 year in D.C., starting in 3 months. Major career opportunity, potential springboard to higher positions. I accepted immediately. 3 months later, I moved to D.C. Michael stayed in Arizona. We discussed it extensively, decided we were solid enough to handle the distance, committed enough to make it work. We'd managed separation before. We could do it again. The Pentagon work was demanding, fascinating, occasionally frustrating. I briefed senior officers, coordinated with other services, helped shape logistics policy that would affect operations worldwide. I was good at it. People listened when I spoke, valued my input, trusted my judgment. Everything Mark's family had joked about, my career being unimportant, my command not caring if I disappeared, no one missing me, had been revealed as projection. They were the ones who struggled with absence. They were the ones who realized too late what they'd lost. And I was the one who'd moved on to bigger things, better things, a life built on actual mutual respect. I didn't gloat about it. I didn't post updates designed to make them feel bad. I simply lived my life, did my work, built my relationships, and let the results speak for themselves. The closing came naturally, not as a dramatic culmination, but as a quiet settling of accounts. I was 3 years past the barbecue now, established in my Pentagon role, respected by colleagues who'd never known the version of me that had shrunk herself to fit into Mark's family. Lieutenant Colonel Elena Ward, Air Force Logistics Officer, someone whose name appeared on staff recommendations and policy briefs, whose input shaped decisions that affected thousands of service members. On the 3rd anniversary of that Sunday afternoon, the day Julia had said I wouldn't be missed, I was sitting in my D.C. apartment, finishing paperwork before a morning briefing. My phone buzzed, a text from Angela Rios, who'd stayed at Luke. She'd sent a screenshot of a Facebook post from Julia. Another anniversary reflection, this one shorter, more resigned. 3 years ago, I made a mistake that cost me someone important. Some lessons you learn too late. I read it, felt nothing except a mild, distant acknowledgement that people sometimes grow. Then I set my phone down and returned to work. Their processing wasn't my concern anymore. Their regret, their realizations, their slow understanding of what they'd had and squandered, those were their burdens to carry, not mine to manage. Michael was visiting that weekend. He'd be there Friday night, and we'd planned a quiet weekend exploring the city, eating good food, existing in the easy companionship we'd built over 3 years. Long distance was harder than living together, but we'd made it work through actual partnership, taking turns visiting, communicating openly, supporting each other's careers without resentment. The Pentagon role was ending soon. I had options: return to Arizona and a potential group command, or take a staff position that would keep me in D.C. for another tour. Patterson, now a brigadier general, had told me I had unlimited potential and should consider the path that positioned me best for future command opportunities. I was leaning toward the group command. Operational leadership appealed to me more than continued staff work. Either way, I was choosing based on what served my career, my goals, my life. Not based on what accommodated someone else's needs or what kept peace with people who'd never valued me. That Friday evening, Michael arrived from the airport and we walked to dinner in Arlington. Over Thai food, I told him about Julia's post, about the anniversary I'd barely registered. "Do you ever want to reach out?" he asked. Not to reconcile, just to, I don't know, acknowledge their growth. I thought about it. No, I said finally. Their growth is good for them. But it doesn't change what happened, doesn't undo 3 years of disrespect. I don't need their apologies or their regret. I just need them to not be part of my life. That's fair, he said. We talked about other things, his work, my upcoming career decision, places we wanted to travel when schedules aligned. Normal relationship conversation, built on mutual interest and respect. The kind of dynamic I'd once thought I had with Mark, before I'd realized I was the only one maintaining it. Walking home that night, hand in hand through DC streets, I thought about the woman I'd been 3 years earlier. Driving 2 hours every weekend to be tolerated. Covering bills and providing childcare and organizing events for people who'd treated my effort as obligation rather than gift. Standing in that backyard in uniform, exhausted from a 36-hour shift, while my sister-in-law announced that my disappearance wouldn't matter. That woman had made the hardest, most necessary choice of her life. She'd believed the disrespect was real, acted on that belief, and left. And in leaving, she discovered she was capable of building something better. The Julia who'd made that comment at the barbecue had been wrong about everything that mattered. My command had cared enough to promote me ahead of timeline, to give me challenging assignments, to recognize my competence repeatedly. People had missed me, real people who'd valued me, people I'd met after leaving who'd become genuine friends. And I'd thrived without Mark's family in ways I never could have while trying to maintain my place in their hierarchy. They were living with the silence I'd left behind, yes. But that silence wasn't punishment or revenge. It was simply the natural consequence of pushing someone away until they stopped trying to stay. They'd spent 3 years processing that loss, posting anniversary reflections, apparently reorganizing their understanding of what had happened. And I'd spent 3 years building a completely different life, one where I didn't have to justify my existence or prove my worth or accept disrespect disguised as family dynamics. Sometimes the quietest exit does leave the loudest echo. But echoes fade and life continues. They'd eventually stop marking anniversaries, stop posting regrets, stop using me as a cautionary tale about appreciating people while you have them. And I'd continue advancing in my career, building my relationship, existing in spaces where respect was baseline rather than something I had to fight for. The Pentagon assignment ended 4 months later. I took the group command back in Arizona, which meant reuniting with Michael, returning to the base where I'd rebuilt my life, taking on operational leadership that would test and develop me in new ways. Colonel Patterson, now General Patterson, told me at my departure briefing that I was being groomed for bigger things, that my name was on lists for future command positions that could lead to stars if I wanted them. I moved back to Arizona in late spring, took command of my group in a ceremony where my parents, Michael, and Angela Rios sat in the front row. My new boss, a major general named Kendrick, spoke about my record, my potential, my character. Lieutenant Colonel Ward represents the best of what we want in Air Force leadership, he said. She's competent, she's principled, and she cares deeply about the people she leads. I'm proud to have her in this command. Standing there in front of my new unit, I thought briefly about the family who'd once joked I'd be forgotten. They'd been catastrophically wrong, and somewhere in Washington they knew it, lived with it, processed it in their own time. But their realization didn't validate me. My work validated me. My career validated me. The trust of people whose opinions actually mattered validated me. I'd disappeared from their lives exactly as I'd said I would, quietly but completely. And in that disappearance, I'd found something they'd never given me. A life where my presence wasn't just tolerated, but genuinely valued, where I could exist at full size without apology, where respect was automatic rather than something I had to earn repeatedly. They'd asked who'd be forgotten. 3 years later, the answer was clear. They were the ones living with absence, with regret, with the slow understanding that some people, once pushed away, don't come back. And I was the one living with peace, with purpose, with the profound relief of having chosen myself over their comfort. Sometimes that's what disappearing looks like, not vanishing into nothing, but walking away from people who couldn't see your worth and building something better with people who could. The echo they heard in my absence wasn't my voice calling back, it was just the sound of empty space where I used to stand, holding up their world without recognition. And that space, I'd finally learned, wasn't mine to fill anymore. So that's how disappearing on my own terms became the best decision I ever made. Their joke aged fast, and the silence that followed said everything. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever walked away from people who swore you'd never be missed? Did they notice when you stopped carrying the weight of the relationship? And if you left right now, who in your life would suddenly realize just how much you did for them? Drop your story in the comments. Someone needs to read it. And if you got anything from this, hit like, subscribe, and share this with someone who needs a reminder. Your absence can be louder than your presence.